Did you know that one of humanity's greatest spiritual secrets was destroyed by the very hands of religious leaders? Yes, this really happened. And we're not talking about a simple ancient document. We're talking about a sacred African manuscript that was deemed too dangerous to continue to exist. Have you ever wondered why certain texts never made it into your Bible? Have you ever stopped to think about how many stories were erased, how many truths were hidden, and how much spiritual knowledge was silenced, all so that only one narrative would be accepted? This manuscript you're about to learn about was deliberately burned, hidden, banned. And the reason is simply shocking. It revealed profound spiritual truths about the divine connection with the African people and challenged the religious control established for centuries. You've always heard that Africa is just a backdrop to biblical history. But what if I told you that Africa was actually one of the cradles of divine revelation? That African spiritual communities existed with sacred texts that spoke of God, angels, and even Jesus, long before Rome took control of the faith? Why doesn't anyone talk about this? Why has the history of African Christianity been erased? And even more so, why destroy a manuscript instead of studying it? The answer may be harsh, but it's the reality. What was written there could not be read by the masses. The contents of this manuscript threatened everything that had been defined as official truth by the leadership of the Western Church. And when truth threatens power, it is silenced. This text offered a completely different spiritual vision of humanity. It spoke of soul, identity, divine origin, and purpose, in a way that placed the African people as an essential part of sacred history, something that was never well received by religious authorities in the past, nor by those today. Have you heard of the Ethiopian texts, the Coptic writings, the forgotten Gospels of the African tradition? Well, know that many of these documents were rejected not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient, powerful, transformative. And the manuscript you'll learn about today was one of the most threatening ever discovered. Just imagine, what if it contained hidden details about Jesus, revelations of forgotten prophecies, or even spiritual descriptions that contradict centuries of religious doctrine? Now imagine, this being read by thousands of ordinary people. What would happen? Can you understand why this manuscript was erased from history? Because he brought light where there was only shadow. Because he liberated where they wanted control. Because he revealed where they chose to hide. And today, in this video, we're going to break that silence. We'll show you what this manuscript said, why it was feared, and how its existence changes everything you've been taught about faith, the Bible, and yourself. But to understand the depth of what was hidden and the impact of this truth on your spiritual life, you need to know the background behind this destruction. Who wrote this manuscript? Where was it found? And why did so many authorities fight to erase it from history? And before we delve deeper into this revelation, I have an important request for you. If you've come this far, it's because this topic has also awakened something within you. So leave your comment below. Have you ever heard of destroyed African manuscripts? Why do you think this story was silenced for so long? Your feedback is crucial. It not only strengthens this community of truth seekers, but also shows YouTube that this content needs to reach more people. And take the opportunity to like it right now. This simple gesture helps the video be recommended to those who, like you, are looking for answers that are not heard from pulpits or traditional theological schools. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Here, with each new video, we reveal what has been hidden for centuries. This is the space where the forbidden mysteries of biblical and spiritual history are brought to light, without fear, without censorship, with depth and respect for your spiritual intelligence. Now take a deep breath, because what we're about to reveal will take you to one of the most ignored and most powerful chapters in humanity's sacred history. Now that you know about the existence of this forbidden African manuscript, we need to take a step back and look at something that's almost never taught in churches, schools, or even seminaries: the deep and surprising connection between the African continent and early Christianity. This part of history has been systematically erased or ignored, and so it's crucial that you learn about it, carefully and without rushing. Before Rome, before the great cathedrals of Europe, even before the Bible was organized as we know it today, there were already African Christian communities preserving and writing sacred texts. While many imagine that Christianity was born and grew only in the Middle East and then spread throughout Europe, The truth is that Africa was one of the first places where the Christian faith flourished with strength and depth. Let's start with a sacred place many don't even imagine: Ethiopia. Yes, Ethiopia not only had direct contact with Christian teachings in the early centuries, but also maintained a spiritual tradition that has withstood the test of time, wars, colonization, and attempts to silence it by Western religious authorities. The history of Ethiopian Christianity is marked by resilience and authenticity. Do you remember the story in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 8, when the Apostle Philip meets an Ethiopian and baptizes him? This man was an official of the Queen of Ethiopia, someone who was thirsty to know more about God. This encounter is just the tip of the iceberg. Christianity spread so deeply in Ethiopia that by the 4th century, the country had officially adopted Christianity as its state religion, long before many European kingdoms. And do you know what's most impressive? Ethiopia still preserves sacred manuscripts that have never been altered by Western tradition. Manuscripts written in Ge'ez, a sacred language preserved for centuries. These texts contain stories that have been removed or reinterpreted by the dominant churches. They speak of angels, spiritual wars, cosmic revelations, and the importance of the African people within the divine narrative. Another forgotten spiritual center is Egypt, more specifically Alexandria, which was one of the greatest intellectual and spiritual hubs of antiquity. It housed the largest library in the ancient world, and also vibrant Christian communities that studied, copied, and commented on the scriptures. The Coptic Christians of Egypt are heirs to this tradition. They preserved ancient manuscripts that conveyed deeply mystical insights into the faith, many of which never reached the West. It's also worth remembering that long before the councils that defined the biblical canon, that is, the officially accepted books, these African Christians were already reading, interpreting, and writing texts considered sacred. This brings us to the burning question: who decided which texts should be preserved and which should be burned? The answer requires us to look to Nubia, a powerful African kingdom that stretched across present-day Sudan and parts of Egypt. Few people know this, but Nubia was one of the most deeply Christianized regions of the ancient world. Its temples, churches, and manuscripts reveal a living, vibrant faith, full of symbols that profoundly expressed African spirituality. However, over time, these records were destroyed, forgotten, or buried by the dust of history. What do all these places, Ethiopia, Egypt, Nubia, have in common? They all kept manuscripts. They all preserved profound spiritual traditions. And all, at some point, suffered attempts at erasure, censorship, or destruction. What is destroyed, hidden, silenced, usually carries power. It carries truth. It carries revelation. And this is where we return to the central point of this video: the African manuscript destroyed by religious leaders. When you understand that Africa was an active and profound spiritual center, everything begins to make sense. They didn't destroy this text by accident. They knew what they were doing. They knew the impact that truth would have on the structures they built around faith. It's impossible to talk about the history of Christianity without mentioning Africa. And yet, what we see most in churches is silence. Why isn't the Ethiopian Gospels discussed? Why isn't the theology of Coptic Christians studied? Why isn't the African councils that discussed faith, soul, and eternity discussed even before Rome took a stand? Do you know why? Because this part of history doesn't favor the narrative centered on European power. Because recognizing the African contribution to Christianity gives a voice to a people who have always been portrayed as supporting characters, when in fact they have always been protagonists. African manuscripts are, in practice, living testimonies of faith before religious colonization. They are windows into a more organic spirituality, more connected to nature, more sensitive to spiritual experiences. And this is precisely the kind of faith that was combated, censored, and ridiculed by religious authorities seeking control, not transformation. Many of these texts were hidden in caves, buried in the desert, preserved by secret monks, until they were rediscovered centuries later. And when modern scholars had access to them, the reactions were the same: astonishment, resistance, and fear. Because many of these writings spoke of angels with African appearances, of purification rituals rooted in the earth, of a Christ who connected directly with the people's ancestry. All of this was too much for the dogmas controlled by Rome. And now that you're here, watching this video, you need to know that this truth lives on, and it's waiting to be rediscovered by people like you. People who aren't content with pre-made versions, who sense there's something more, something hidden, something powerful, something not covered in textbooks or Sunday school lessons. So, before I continue, answer me honestly. Do you believe that the history of faith has been manipulated? That there are spiritual truths that have been purposefully hidden? If you believe, comment below, Africa is a spiritual root, or I want to know the truth, because this type of comment shows that you are among those who truly want to awaken. And yes, do comment, because this helps YouTube understand that this content has value, that it needs to be spread, that it deserves to reach more people. Let's move on. Because now that you understand Africa's role in the early centuries of the faith, it's time to delve deeper and discover what exactly was written in that forbidden manuscript, and why it was seen as such a threat to religious authority. Now that you understand the deep connection between Africa and the early centuries of Christianity, you might be wondering, what exactly was the manuscript that was destroyed? Where was it found? What exactly did it say that caused so much distress? And why, among so many ancient texts, did this particular one need to be eliminated at any cost? The answer is as delicate as it is disturbing. This manuscript, known by some scholars as the Gospel of the Black Light, was reportedly originally found in an ancient Christian community near what we now know as the border between Sudan and Ethiopia. It didn't have that name when it was written, of course. That title was given centuries later, alluding to its mystical content and its emphasis on African spirituality as a direct source of divine revelation. It was a text preserved on papyrus sheets, written in ancient Ge'ez, the same sacred language used by Ethiopian monks. Its origins are believed to date back to the 2nd or 3rd century, meaning it was written before the New Testament was even officially organized, and that alone would be enough to bother many. But the problem wasn't the chronology, it was the content. This manuscript described a series of teachings said to have been delivered by a divine messenger to a community of black believers in a mountainous region of East Africa. It was no ordinary theological treatise. It was a revelation, a call to spiritual awareness that directly connected the African people to the fiery face of the Creator, an expression the manuscript used to refer to the divine face that, according to it, dwells in darkness with light that burns away injustice. One of the most controversial, and at the same time most impactful, passages stated that those who came from the north changed the words of the Most High so that the people would bow before earthly kings, not the Spirit. In other words, the text directly accused the dominant religious system of having modified the essence of faith to transform it into an instrument of political control. Furthermore, the manuscript taught that true connection with the Holy Spirit did not depend on temples, dogmas, or intermediaries, but on an inner reconnection with the ancestral breath, a language that united faith, ethnic identity, and mystical spirituality. Imagine what this kind of revelation would cause within an environment dominated by religious institutions that taught that salvation was only possible through the authority of the church, that claimed only certain books were inspired, and that any other narrative should be classified as heresy. This text was simply explosive, but it doesn't stop there. The manuscript also claimed that Jesus had spiritually walked through the southern lands, and that angels had appeared in dreams to black men and women, revealing visions of the kingdom of God even before the rise of the Roman Church. In other words, it asserted that divine revelation was not the property of a culture, a language, or a race, but a river that flowed freely wherever the Spirit chose to flow. It was a direct threat to any system that sought to monopolize faith. And this explains why, soon after being discovered by European explorers in the late 19th century, during a clandestine excavation led by missionaries interested in converting the natives, the manuscript was removed from its original location, transported in secret to a religious center in southern Europe, studied in silence by influential theologians, and then burned. There are unofficial records that claim 3 copies were made before its destruction, but to date, none have been found or publicly displayed. What remains are only fragments, mentions in missionary diaries, and, curiously, passages of the text itself that were copied by African monks before its removal. These, in fact, are kept in secret monasteries to this day. Some passages survived because the elders themselves knew what was there was too sacred to disappear. They hand-copied portions of the content and orally passed down the spiritual interpretations for generations, keeping the essence of the message alive even in the face of persecution. And why does all this matter to you? Because if you really want to understand what was hidden from you, you need to look between the lines. We're not just talking about a lost manuscript. We're talking about an entire spiritual movement that was erased. We're talking about a system that chose what you could and couldn't read, what should and shouldn't be considered the Word of God. This text stated that the body is the temple of the Spirit, but that ancestral blood carries a divine memory. It stated that true faith has no color, but that the Creator speaks to each people in the language of their soul. It stated that the cross is not a symbol of guilt, but of rebirth, and that everyone who reconnects with their spiritual origin is in Christ, even without knowing His name. Now imagine the impact of this on a church that, for centuries, had claimed that Africa was a land of spiritual darkness and that its people needed to be saved. Imagine the shock of discovering that Africa was not the object of salvation, but the bearer of it. This is the real reason the manuscript was destroyed. It restored the spiritual dignity of a people. It restored a direct connection with God, without dependence on imposed dogma, without needing Roman validation, without needing theological approval. And what's more, it called the people to awaken, an inner, profound, and non-transferable awakening. And that's why you need to keep watching this video, because the next revelation goes even deeper. You'll discover what else this manuscript hid, and how it was linked to other texts considered apocryphal, forbidden, or hidden throughout history. But before I continue, I want to know, what are you feeling as you listen to all this? Can you believe that manuscripts like this still exist hidden out there? Do you think there are truths that institutional religion doesn't want us to know? If you feel that something inside you is awakening with this message, comment below right now. I want to know what they hid from me, or the truth cannot be burned. These phrases will show that you are walking together on this journey of revelation, and at the same time help this video reach more people who, like you, no longer accept living in imposed spiritual ignorance. Now take a deep breath, because what we're going to reveal in the next part will shake up everything you understand about faith. Let's move on. You've already understood that this manuscript was no ordinary text, but now it's time to look at the heart of the conflict. The burning question remains: why was this manuscript considered so dangerous that it was burned? What was there that so threatened the very fabric of institutionalized faith? What kinds of words were seen as unacceptable, heretical, unforgivable? The answer lies in the preserved passages themselves, fragments that survived the destruction, that escaped censorship, and that reveal a direct confrontation with the foundations of Western theology. From the very first lines of the manuscript, the tone was already different. It wasn't a text bound by the rigidity of dogmatic structure. It was fluid, poetic, and profoundly spiritual. One passage read, "The voice of the Holy One blows from the south like fire that clears the field, and on the black face of the earth, the Most High writes His mysteries." This statement alone would have been considered absurd by many religious leaders of that time, and perhaps even today. Why? Because it placed the African continent as the place of direct manifestation of divine glory, without needing to pass through Jerusalem, Rome, or any other institutionalized center. Another passage read, "It is not in the temple of stone that the presence dwells, but in the tent of flesh, where the blood sings with the memory of the first breath." This idea directly challenged the liturgical structure of the dominant church, which taught that salvation and divine presence were conditioned on participation in sacred rites conducted by priests. For the manuscript, the true temple was the body itself, and the Spirit of God dwelt in those who recognized their spiritual origin, regardless of race, geography, or doctrine. Further on, another shocking passage stated, "The true light was given before the scribes imprisoned it in parchment. The Spirit speaks before the letter, and the children of the dark earth heard first, but were silenced by iron and the cross." This sentence seemed a direct indictment of religious authorities who, by institutionalizing faith, had emptied living spirituality and replaced revelation with controlled tradition. The text placed Africans as the first listeners of the Spirit, and also as the first victims of spiritual censorship. These words, for the religious leaders who controlled theological discourse, sounded like a real threat, because they not only revealed a free and non-institutionalized spirituality, but also denounced a type of historical and spiritual erasure that is still barely discussed today. For those who held power over the interpretation of Scripture, over salvation, over rights. This manuscript was a bombshell, a threat to the authority built over centuries. The text also denied religious hierarchy as necessary for mediation between man and God. In a preserved passage, it is written, "The Father speaks directly to the heart of the righteous. There is no veil that separates the Creator from those who walk in truth." This broke with the idea that a priest, a pope, a pastor, an institution, was needed to intercede on someone's behalf. Here, faith was direct, intense, without barriers, without clergy, without control. But perhaps the most controversial passage of all is the one in which the manuscript asserts that the Christ manifested himself among the nations, and each people knew him by name, and that wherever there was love and justice, the Spirit had already passed. This assertion challenged one of the pillars of Western doctrine, the exclusivity of salvation through the name of Jesus, as interpreted by the dominant church. The manuscript did not deny Christ, but expanded him, and this was intolerable to those who sought a controlled, limited, and standardized faith. Can you grasp the magnitude of the problem? Imagine religious leaders who spent centuries constructing a theology based on the need for obedience, submission to the church, and sacramental dependence. And then an ancient manuscript appears from Africa, telling you that you don't need intermediaries, that God's light already dwells within you, that spirituality predates institutions, and that African peoples knew this from the beginning. Of course, this was considered unacceptable. The text also harshly criticized the use of faith as a tool of oppression. One fragment states, "Those who claim to serve the light, but crush the little ones with the weight of laws, they do not know the Holy One. They are shadows of power dressed in white." This direct critique of religious hypocrisy, oppressive moralism, and the manipulation of the people through guilt also deeply disturbed. It was as if the manuscript exposed the contradictions of religion clearly and boldly, like a mirror no one wanted to look into. But why are these words so impactful even today? Because many of these ideas remain censored to this day. Because there is a resistance to admitting that the original African faith was pure, legitimate, and powerful, and that it was erased so another narrative could be imposed. Because there is still fear that people will discover that true spirituality is accessible, profound, and predates any denomination. This manuscript contained a liberating truth. And liberating truths disturb structures that thrive on fear. That's why it was considered dangerous. Not because it was false, but because it was too true. Not because it was heretical, but because it was free. And now, hearing this, you might also be wondering, how many other truths were buried? How many other manuscripts were hidden or destroyed? And how does all this change the way you see your own spiritual journey? Comment below, "The truth sets me free," or "I reject manipulated faith," to show that you are here not out of curiosity, but out of a thirst for revelation. Your comment not only strengthens this community of truth seekers, but also helps this video be recommended to more awakening people. We need to spread this message. We need to break this silence. Now breathe, because in the next part, we'll reveal who was responsible for erasing this manuscript from history, and what else they destroyed along the way. You won't believe what comes next. Let's continue. Now that you know the revealing content of this African manuscript and understand why it was considered so dangerous to the dogmas of the time, one question remains that needs to be answered clearly and courageously. Who ordered its destruction? Because a text of this magnitude, with so much spiritual wisdom, with such transformative power, doesn't disappear on its own. It was silenced, erased, burned, by human hands, by well-defined interests. And the most frightening thing is that we're not talking about pagan kings, distant emperors, or atheist leaders. No, we're talking about religious institutions. We're talking about ecclesiastical leaders. We're talking about men who wore sacred robes, but whose hearts were committed to power, not to truth. The most reliable accounts indicate that the order to destroy this manuscript came from within a hidden alliance between sectors of the European clergy and colonial agents infiltrated in evangelizing missions on the African continent. The 19th century was a period marked by a frantic race for control, political, economic, and above all, spiritual. And Africa was seen by many as an open field. But what these colonizers found upon arriving there was very different from what they expected. They found faith, they found texts, they found wisdom, and this destabilized them. Imagine the scene. Missionaries sent to convert the savages, discovering that those same savages held parchments older than those canonized in Rome, discovering that those communities already spoke of the Spirit, of the Christ of light, of the presence of the Almighty, but under different names, in different forms, with different intensity. This was inconceivable for those who carried the banner of the one truth. So when the manuscript known as the Black Light Gospel was discovered by religious explorers in northern Ethiopia, what was supposed to be a cause for celebration and spiritual inquiry quickly became a threat to be eliminated. The text's content was read, analyzed, and considered a real threat to the Church's doctrinal hegemony. And here, we cannot fail to mention the direct involvement of representatives of the Holy See, especially sectors of the Vatican linked to the so-called Holy Office, the same branch responsible for monitoring, censoring, and, if necessary, condemning ideas considered heretical. These men, in the name of preserving the orthodoxy of the faith, signed the death warrant for an ancient knowledge that could liberate millions. The manuscript was confiscated and secretly transported to a European center, where it underwent a rapid theological evaluation. But this wasn't an analysis in search of truth. It was a screening process to decide whether it should be suppressed or not. And the decision was clear: total destruction. But why? Because that text contradicted centuries of dogmatic teaching, because it questioned the authority of the Church, because it pointed to a faith that didn't depend on temples, rituals, or intermediaries, because it suggested that the connection with God could be direct, free, and alive, and that Africans were an active part of this spiritual history from the beginning. The most painful thing is understanding that this wasn't an isolated act. This destruction was part of a larger policy, a policy of spiritual domination. For centuries, sacred texts were burned, libraries were looted, monks were killed, traditions were ridiculed, all to erase any possibility that other versions of the truth might emerge. And behind all this, what was always at stake was power. Not the power of faith, but power over minds, over souls, over the narrative. History is written by those who win, and faith, when controlled, becomes a tool of submission. This same structure that promoted the Crusades, that silenced prophetic women, that hid alternative gospels, that condemned liberating voices to the fire, was the structure that decided that this African manuscript could not survive, because if it did, it would raise too many questions, and they were not prepared to answer them. And mind you, many of those who participated in this weren't faithless. They were men who believed they were protecting the flock, but they were blinded by the arrogance of certainty. They didn't understand that faith doesn't need to be protected from truth. It needs to be nourished by it. Others, however, knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that by eliminating that text, they were ensuring that the story would continue to be told by a single mouth. They knew that by burning those words, they were erasing the possibility of a collective spiritual awakening. And yet, they did it anyway, fearfully, coldly, with conviction. Today, centuries later, the traces of that destruction still haunt us. The silence, the absence, the spiritual ignorance into which we were plunged. We grew up unaware that other versions of faith existed, unaware that other peoples were also touched by the Spirit, unaware that humanity's spiritual map is much larger than we were taught. And all of this was the work of a system that mixed faith with power, the Bible with politics, salvation with domination. A system that, instead of guiding people to the light, led them into doctrinal prisons, from which few can escape without pain. But now you're here, and you've already begun to see beyond. You've already begun to sense that something is wrong, that something is hidden, that something needs to come to light. And this is just the beginning, because what we're revealing in this video is part of a much larger journey. A journey of reconnection with pure faith, with forgotten wisdom, with the spiritual heritage that many tried to hide, but which has survived. And before we move on, I want to ask you, do you believe religious institutions may have hidden spiritual truths to maintain control? Do you believe African faith was erased out of fear of its power? Comment below. Right now, I see what they tried to hide, or faith is no one's property. These comments show that you're present, aware, and engaged. And they help this video reach more people who are searching for answers like you. Now get ready, because in the next part, we'll connect the dots. How does the manuscript's content relate to the texts that have come down to us? Are there still traces of this truth hidden within the Bible we have today? That's what we'll find out. Let's continue. Now that you understand who ordered the manuscript's destruction and why it was considered so threatening, it's inevitable that a question will begin to grow in your heart. Did any of this knowledge survive? Could it be that, even with the attempted erasure, some of this ancient African wisdom remained hidden or disguised in the pages of the Bible we have today? This question is powerful, because it not only challenges what you've been taught, but also invites you to look at the scriptures with new eyes, awakened eyes, eyes that aren't afraid to seek, eyes that recognize that the Bible, as we know it today, has passed through many hands, many translations, many interests, and yes, many influences. When you begin to compare fragments of the so-called Black Light Gospel with passages from the modern Bible, you realize there are echoes, there are traces that cannot be ignored, as if even with the attempt to erase it, the truth has found subtle ways to remain. A clear example of this is the mystical language present in books like Proverbs, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, and especially the Gospel of John. In the African manuscript, God was described as "he who dwells in the luminous darkness," an expression that seems contradictory, but which, spiritually, speaks to the depth of the divine mystery. Now consider what is written in 1 Kings 8:12. The Lord said that he would dwell in the darkness. This image, which in Western theology has often been ignored or softened, was central to the manuscript. The idea that God also reveals himself in mystery, in what is not visible, in the hidden, in the fertile shadow of creation, a vision much closer to ancestral African spirituality than to European rationalism. Another interesting point is the way the African manuscript presented Christ. In it, Christ was called Son of the Wind, Mouth of the Invisible, and Mirror of the Spirit, expressions that do not deny his divinity, but rather broaden our understanding of his nature. The text emphasized that Christ was the reflection of the Spirit present everywhere, and that he manifested himself in cultures according to the language of each people. Now consider John 1:9. That was the true light, which enlightens every man coming into the world. And in Acts 10:34-35, Peter says, God shows no partiality, but accepts anyone who fears him and works righteousness, from whatever nation he may be. These verses, when read carefully, seem to speak to the manuscript's idea, a spirituality that transcends cultural boundaries, not bound by geographic or racial identity, but manifests itself wherever there is truth and justice. However, in the way many doctrines have interpreted these texts, this breadth has been restricted. Faith has been territorialized. Revelation has been Europeanized. Christ has been whitewashed, both literally and symbolically. Another surprising element is the idea that ancestral wisdom is a form of spiritual revelation. The manuscript stated, "The breath of the Most High walks with the elders of the earth, for they keep in their bones the memory of the first name." This statement may seem poetic, but it carries a profound truth. The spirituality experienced by African generations before colonization was already in tune with the Spirit of God, even without official religious codes. Now look at Job 12:7-9. But ask the animals, and they will teach you, and the birds of the air, and they will tell you. Or speak to the earth, and it will teach you. Even the fish of the sea will tell you. These verses echo a spirituality connected to creation, to the signs of nature, to the wisdom of the simple, something that also appears in the lost manuscript, but that has been progressively drowned out by theologies centered on academia, hierarchy, and the letter. What's more, there is evidence that parts of this manuscript were reused in apocryphal books, such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip, which were later rejected by official councils. These Gospels, considered Gnostic, use a more symbolic, more interior language, more focused on direct experience with the divine. This is the same tone present in the African manuscript, and it is precisely this tone that was rejected by religious authorities who preferred texts easier to control, interpret, and indoctrinate. So, to answer the question honestly, yes, there are connections with the current Bible, but many of them have been distorted, diluted, or rewritten to fit a mold that served power, not spiritual freedom. In many cases, what was a message became a system. What was experience became ritual. What was revelation became doctrine. And you may never have realized this because you were taught to read the Bible with fear of asking questions, fear of comparing, fear of seeking. But now you're beginning to see, and once your eyes are opened, there's no turning back. The most powerful thing is to realize that we don't need to reject the Bible to recognize what was done to it. We can indeed love the scriptures and still understand that they have been shaped over the centuries by human interests, and that perhaps, by seeking lost fragments, like this destroyed manuscript, we are actually rescuing parts of the very body of the Word. And if you've made it this far, I want to invite you to do something very important. Comment below, "I read with my eyes open," or "The Bible holds more than I was taught." These comments not only strengthen our space here, but also signal to YouTube that this content is relevant, in-depth, and necessary. And above all, they show that you are part of a movement that no longer accepts living trapped in imposed ignorance. Now get ready, because in the next part we'll talk about how religious censorship has shaped Christianity throughout history, erasing books, distorting narratives, and redefining truths. What follows is even more revealing. Let's continue. If until now you thought the disappearance of the African manuscript was an isolated event, perhaps motivated by a cultural dispute or religious ignorance, now is the time to prepare for a reality check. What happened to that manuscript was no exception. It was part of a pattern, a system, a structure that, for centuries, operated with a single objective: to silence voices, erase truths, select which revelations would survive and which should be destroyed. And to understand this pattern, we need to talk about censorship within the history of Christianity itself. A censorship that began long before the invention of the printing press, long before the Protestant Reformation, and that shaped the faith as we know it today. We're talking about religious councils, arbitrary decisions, imperial interests, disputes between theologians, and, above all, fear. Fear that the full truth would free people from institutional control. Have you heard of the Book of Enoch? Well, it was one of the most read and respected books by early Christians. Copies of it were found alongside the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's cited in the Bible itself, in the letter of Jude, and yet it was excluded. Why? Because Enoch brings cosmic revelations. He speaks of the fall of the angels, of the divine's contact with humanity, of celestial visions that completely defy the linear and rigid narrative imposed by dogma. In the Book of Enoch, the spiritual world is dynamic, interactive, and profound. It features angels who teach humans, celestial beings who descend to earth, and codes of wisdom that don't fit into the doctrinal system developed in subsequent centuries. For religious leaders who wanted to centralize access to revelation, this type of content was simply too dangerous. But it wasn't just Enoch. The Book of Jubilees, which retells the stories of Genesis and Exodus with additional detail, was also deemed unacceptable. It presents a completely different timeline, with an emphasis on cycles, sacred dates, and interpretations that give prominence to forgotten characters. This book's exclusion wasn't because it was less inspired, it was because it was more questioning. And what about the apocryphal Gospels? Texts like the Gospel of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, and Philip, they all portray a more intimate, more interior Jesus, more focused on personal enlightenment than institutional submission. In these texts, Jesus invites the reader to look within, to discover the divine spark within their own being. He is not there as the center of a religious empire, but as a spiritual guide who breaks structures. He is the mystical, liberating Christ, not the political Christ domesticated by imperial theology. These books were condemned as heretical. They were persecuted. They were burned. And even when they survived in secret copies, they were hidden in the deserts, buried and sealed. Because there was a clear fear that people would discover that the revelation was not the property of the church, that the Holy Spirit blew where it pleased, that true faith did not fit into dogma. And look, we're not talking about fake books. We're talking about books considered sacred by thousands of Christians for centuries, books that formed communities, that inspired prayers, that shaped spiritualities, until they were declared inconvenient. And that's the point. Spiritual censorship has never been about falsehood. It's always been about convenience. When a text confirms the authority of the church, it is inspired. When it invites spiritual freedom, it is heretical. When it reinforces obedience to hierarchy, it is doctrinal. When it reveals that God speaks directly to the people, without intermediaries, it is dangerous. And this pattern has repeated itself so many times throughout history that it is impossible to ignore. It was the same with Enoch. It was the same with Jubilees. It was the same with the Gnostic Gospels. And it was the same with the African manuscript I presented to you in this video. Do you see the cycle? discovery, astonishment, attempt to understand, reaction from power, censorship, destruction, silence. But the most ironic, and at the same time most beautiful thing, is that despite all their efforts, the truth survived, not the way they wanted, not under their control, but in fragments, in oral memories, in buried texts, in forgotten traditions, and now, in your consciousness. You may never have read the Book of Enoch, but something inside you recognizes its energy. You may never have heard of the apocryphal Gospels, but when you hear that Jesus spoke of the inner light, something pulses in your spirit. You may never have touched the lost African manuscript, but when you hear its messages, your heart confirms, this is real, this is divine, this is me. And that's the real reason so many texts have been censored. They don't inform, they awaken. They take faith from the distant altar and place it in the hearts of those who listen. They don't ask you to obey. They call you to remember, to reconnect, to take hold of what is already yours by spiritual right. Now tell me honestly, do you think it's fair for an institution to decide for you what is and isn't sacred? Do you believe that God only speaks through texts authorized by men? Or do you feel, like I do, that there is something much bigger than what has been allowed to show? If you've come this far with an open heart, thirsty for truth, with the courage to break the silence, comment below, I want to know the hidden books, or truth is greater than doctrine. These comments show that you are ready to be part of a generation that no longer accepts being fed spiritual crumbs, and they help this video to be distributed to more seekers, to more brothers and sisters who, like you, feel that something has always been missing. Now get ready, because in the next part, we'll talk about the spiritual and social consequences of this historic censorship. What did humanity lose by ignoring these books? And what can we recover now? Let's continue. Now that you understand how censorship shaped Christianity and silenced profound revelations throughout history, it's time to look at what was intentionally and systematically left out. African spiritual wisdom. What few talk about, and many don't even know, is that even before the arrival of institutionalized Christianity on the continent, African peoples already cultivated a direct, profound, and reverent connection with the sacred. This wisdom not only dialogued with the teachings of Christ, but anticipated them in many ways. And when they finally came into contact with the message of the gospel, they recognized in it something familiar, not strange. African spirituality has always seen divinity as present in creation, in people, in the cycles of nature, and in the rhythms of life. There was no separation between the material and spiritual worlds. Everything was a manifestation of the divine. The sacred lived not only in temples or books, but in the beating of the drum, in the healing dance, in the words of the elder, in the dreams of the child, in the shade of the tree, in the silence of dawn. This holistic vision of faith, which integrates body, soul, nature, and community, carries a depth that challenges the rigidity of westernized doctrines. And when Jesus' message reached these lands, it was not seen as an imposition, but as a reunion, a recognition. Many African sages heard about Christ and said, "This one you call the Son of God was already walking with us." It wasn't rejection, it was acceptance, the message of love, justice, liberation, reconnection with the Spirit. All of this was already part of the African spiritual imagination, just under a different name, a different form, but the same essence. But, unfortunately, this heritage was erased. It was labeled pagan, savage, demonic. And this was not because it was incompatible with Christianity, but because it was incompatible with European religious domination. It was too dangerous to admit that Africa already had faith before the cross arrived. It was too uncomfortable to acknowledge that the people they sought to dominate already walked with God. Did you know, for example, that in many African cultures there was the concept of a supreme spirit that could not be represented by images and was considered the source of all creation? This concept, present among peoples such as the Yoruba, Bantu, and Ashanti, is very similar to what we call God the Father. There was also the figure of spiritual messengers, the Orishas, the Inkisis, the Vodans, who functioned as channels between the divine and humans, something strongly reminiscent of the role of angels, prophets, and even the Holy Spirit itself. Furthermore, African spirituality has always valued the memory of ancestors, not as idols, but as those who paved spiritual paths, who still live in the invisible realm, and who intercede for their descendants. Doesn't this resemble the biblical concept of a cloud of witnesses mentioned in Hebrews 12:1, or the role of intercessors that some recognize in the saints? The truth is, there's more connection between these views than they'd like to admit. But what's most powerful is realizing how African wisdom valued the community as a sacred place. Healing was collective. Worship was communal. Blessings were transmitted in circles, not in lines. This challenges modern religious individualism and reminds us that faith is born, grows, and flourishes in encounters. It is in embraces, in song, in shared food, that the sacred manifests itself. For many, this has been mistaken for paganism, but in essence, it is pure gospel. And even in the face of centuries of oppression, forced conversion, and cultural erasure, this wisdom has endured. It has survived in songs, proverbs, fireside stories, grandmother's gestures, rhythmic clapping, the scent of natural incense, rites of passage, and whispered words at dawn. It has survived until now, and is waiting to be restored. Because this wisdom does not belong to the past. It is present. It is powerful. It is the key to understanding that God was never confined to the walls of temples or the pages of books. He has always spoken to all peoples, in all languages, in all landscapes. And yes, he spoke to Africa. He spoke through her. He still speaks. That's why it's so important to reclaim this heritage. It's not about syncretism, as many say. It's about spiritual reparation, about recognition, about restoration. Because only when we look at Christianity through decolonized eyes can we understand its true depth. An African Christ, dark-skinned, walking among the poor, touching the marginalized, healing with clay and saliva, teaching with parables that speak of earth, seeds, bread, and wine. This isn't heresy. It's reconnecting with our roots. If, upon hearing all this, you feel something inside you ignite, it's because this memory is alive within you, even if you were never told, even if you were taught to reject it, even if they tried to erase it. The spark remains. Spiritual ancestry doesn't die. It simply sleeps, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And maybe that moment is now. So, before we move on, I want to invite you to leave a simple but powerful sentence in the comments. African wisdom lives in me, or I recognize the faith of my ancestors. These comments are much more than engagement. They are declarations. They are seeds you plant publicly, saying, I no longer accept living separated from my spiritual heritage. And what's more, they help this video reach more people who also need to hear this truth. If you've made it this far, take a deep breath, because what we're about to reveal will connect everything we've already discussed. The lost manuscript, religious censorship, erased books, and forgotten spirituality. With your role at this very moment in history. The next part is personal. Let's continue. And now that you've heard all this, tell me, how do you feel? Because perhaps the most pressing question right now is no longer, why did they hide all this? But rather, why does this still matter today? And I want to answer you with complete clarity and sincerity. It matters because the faith of millions of people was built on an incomplete, manipulated, and mutilated foundation. It matters because by erasing the texts, by silencing the prophets, by burning the manuscripts, and by demonizing African spirituality, they also stole something precious, our spiritual identity. Have you ever stopped to think about what it means to live a lifetime of faith, believing that your color, your origin, your culture, and your roots are not part of sacred history? Have you ever felt like you needed to fit into a model of spirituality that didn't speak to your experience, your soul, your body? Well, it's true. This isn't a coincidence. This was designed. Millions of people grew up believing that to be accepted by God, they would need to deny who they were, that they would need to whiten their faith, soften their voice, hide their features, domesticate their essence. How many times within churches have we seen African cultural expressions being called of the devil, while European practices were extolled as holy? How many times has the image of Jesus been painted as a blue-eyed European, as if dark Middle Eastern skin, or even more so, a possible African origin, were a threat to holiness? This distortion not only erased Africa's participation in the spiritual formation of humanity, it also shattered the spiritual self-esteem of entire generations. Because if you're told your culture is demonic, your ancestors were ignorant, your language is witchcraft, your rhythm is carnal, then you begin to reject your own soul, thinking you're pleasing God. And this, my brother, my sister, is one of the greatest spiritual wounds left by colonizing Christianity. A faith that was supposed to liberate, but was used to imprison. A word that was supposed to heal, but was shaped to dominate. A Bible that could include, but was interpreted to exclude. That's why knowledge of these destroyed manuscripts, these erased books, these rejected spiritual traditions, is so important today. Because we're not just talking about ancient history, we're talking about a healing that needs to happen now. A healing that begins with understanding, that passes through memory, and that culminates in reconciliation with what we've been taught to forget. Do you feel that emptiness? That feeling that something is missing in your faith even though you pray, fast, go to church, read the Bible? That feeling that there's something beyond what you've been told, but that you can't access? This discomfort isn't a doubt. It's your soul wanting to remember. It's your spiritual ancestry trying to resurface. It's the Spirit calling you back to your roots. And when we begin to reclaim this wisdom, we understand why they're afraid. Because once you understand who you are, no one can control you anymore. Once you recognize that the Almighty has always walked with His people, no one can make you feel unworthy. Once you see that your spirituality is centuries old, has a voice, has strength, no one can extinguish your light. That's why this matters today. Because the true spiritual revolution of our generation won't happen in cathedrals or theological conferences. It will happen on street corners, in circles, in bedrooms, in communities, when each of us decides to reconnect with what was torn away. Faith no longer needs to be an instrument of domination. It can, and must, be an instrument of liberation, healing, and the rebuilding of our spiritual dignity. And more than that, rescuing this forgotten African wisdom is also an act of spiritual justice. It's telling past generations that we haven't forgotten, that their chants, their oracles, their prayers, their visions weren't in vain, that the flame they tried to extinguish remains lit within us. Modern spirituality is hungry. People are tired of ready-made answers, rigid doctrines, and discourses that exclude, control, and oppress. There is a thirst for real connection, for depth, for meaning, and ancestral African wisdom, in harmony with the pure teachings of Christ, can be that path, a path of reconciliation between faith and identity, between spirit and truth, between present and past. So you who are watching now, pay attention. What you're hearing here isn't just a lesson. It's a call to look at yourself with new eyes, to reevaluate your spiritual journey, to reclaim all that was lost, including within yourself. Maybe that's why you're here, not by chance, not out of curiosity, but because your soul recognized the sound of what is true. And if this video is touching you like this, it's because what was silenced is still alive. And if it's alive, it can be restored. So now I ask you, comment below, I am the continuity of forgotten wisdom, or my faith carries the memory of my ancestors. These comments are like spiritual declarations. They tell the world, and yourself, that you are no longer asleep, that you are remembering. And of course, they also help this video reach other people who, like you, are in the same process of spiritual awakening. If you feel this message needs to resonate, share this video with those you love. The healing that began within you can reach many. And take a deep breath, because in the next part, we'll dive even deeper. What would your faith be like today if all this knowledge had been preserved? And what's more, what can you do from now on to restore what was lost? Let's continue. If you've made it this far, with an open heart, an attentive soul, and an awakened mind, then you're no longer the same person you were when you started this video. Something inside you has been touched, and it can't and shouldn't stop here. So I want to make you a sacred invitation. Subscribe to the channel now, because every week we're together on this journey of reconnection, decolonization of faith, and restoration of the spiritual wisdom they tried to erase. Here, you'll hear truths the system doesn't want you to know, and you'll find an entire community seeking the same answers as you. And to seal this moment, leave it here in the comments. I stayed until the end because my soul is waking up. This phrase isn't just a comment. It's a spiritual affirmation. It's as if you're saying to the universe, I choose to remember. I choose to reconnect. If you haven't liked it yet, now is the time. This simple gesture, helps this video reach others who are also seeking light amidst the noise. And last but not least, watch the next video that's appearing here on the screen. It is the continuation of this journey, and I'm sure it will deepen everything you felt today even further. See you there. You're not alone, and this is just the beginning.